what's going on, everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we are going to wrap up our archetype breakdown. We will have one more video after this talking about devotion and kind of monocolored decks, whether or not that's going to be a thing in this format. But for this video, we're going to wrap up the last two color pairs, which are going to be red-black for a sacrifice deck and blue-green, which is another constellation deck kind of in the same vein as blue-white. If you watched the previous video, it's a very loose theme, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. So if you haven't watched the previous videos, you have any interest in what the archetypes are trying to do in this format before the pre-release sneaks up on us here in a couple days, feel free to check out those videos. And as with all of the videos, feel free to comment below if you have any sort of advice as far as the format of these reviews has gone, or if you have just anything to say, if this has helped you in any way, shape, or form get prepared for a pre-release, feel free to drop a like or subscribe to the channel. That would be fantastic. You can also find us on Twitter at MTG_Mana Rocks. But let's go ahead and jump into this video, and we'll start off with red-black, which is a sacrifice deck as it tends to be in most formats. A little bit weird that they went back to Theros, and yes, there are Minotaurs floating around, but red-black isn't really the quote-unquote Minotaur deck the same way it was in Theros. There are no tribal payoffs for Minotaurs. So instead, we have a aristocrats-style deck looking to amass a board of things that you're willing to sacrifice, as well as sacrifice outlets, of which there are quite a few in this set. One thing I want to note here is that a lot of the cards that sacrifice creatures in this set can also sacrifice enchantments. So there's an extra little layer of Theros flavor attached to the Aristocrats deck here. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our payoff cards. Remember that we're going to start each archetype off by talking about the cards that you want to see when you are in this archetype. These are the gold cards or the payoffs that really make your deck come together and kind of make sure that your deck is doing what the game plan intends for it to do. So let's start off with the gold uncommon here for Rakdos. It is Slaughter Priest of Mogis. It's black-red for a 2/2 uncommon creature, Minotaur Shaman. And it says whenever you sacrifice a permanent, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. And in addition to that, you can pay 2 mana and sacrifice another creature or enchantment, and Slaughter Priest of Mogis gains first strike until end of turn. This strikes me as an extremely good gold card for this set because it is both an enabler and a payoff. It gets pumped whenever you sacrifice permanents, and it can also sacrifice permanents itself. And this all adds up to what could potentially be a very powerful card. You can see some situations, it is a little bit best case scenario to think about it this way. But this card could potentially just win the game in one swing, right? If it goes unblocked and you have 4 enchantments, 3 or 4 enchantments that you can sacrifice with a lot of mana, this thing can just pump itself a bunch. And it doesn't get +2/+0 only when it sacrifices a permanent. It's only whenever another permanent gets sacrificed. Of course, whenever you sacrifice a permanent. So some of the other sacrifice outlets that we'll see on this list here help fuel Slaughter Priest of Mogis. I think the real trouble with red-black is not going to be finding the sacrifice outlets, because we will see quite a few of them. It will be finding the actual fodder that you're willing to sacrifice, and we'll talk about that in the next section. But let's look at a couple more of the sacrifice outlets. We have Blood Aspirant at uncommon here. It's 1 in a red for a 1/1. It's a Satyr Berserker, because why not? It says whenever you sacrifice a permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Blood Aspirant. So it starts off as a 2 mana 1/1, which is pretty bad. After you sacrifice the first permanent, it becomes a 2 mana 2/2, which is on par. And it really takes that second counter and beyond to become a good card. So you need to be sacrificing things pretty consistently for Blood Aspirant to turn into a good card, but it's nice that there's no mana investment attached to getting the +1/+1 counter. You just happen to have this on board, and you sacrifice permanents, which presumably your deck wants to do anyway, and your Blood Aspirant will get bigger over time. I don't think this is one of the highest priority cards because it is such a miserable top deck later in the game once you've already sacrificed all your cards, but it is a very nice 2-drop if you can get a mass of them and make sure you have one of these cards on turn 2. It does have an activated ability as well. So again, this is in the same vein as the Slaughter Priest, where it's both a payoff and an enabler all in one card. For 1 in a red, you can tap it and sacrifice a creature or enchantment. Again, you can sack enchantments with these abilities. Blood Aspirant deals 1 damage to target creature. That creature can't block this turn. So you're probably picking off tokens. There actually aren't a lot of 1 toughness creatures in this format from what I saw, but there's a decent number of ways to make tokens in some of the strategies. So that ability can pick off a small creature, or if it can't pick that creature off, it can help to just mitigate blocks, right? You can take your opponent's best creature out of the equation for combat. It is a little bit awkward that this thing has to tap to do that ability. So you don't get to grow it and swing with it the same turn you activate the ability. But I don't think you're using that ability too often because 1 damage is a pretty steep cost for sacrificing a whole creature or enchantment. And as I said before, there's not a lot of expendable stuff going on. But we'll see a couple cards that kind of combo with Blood Aspirant. And I do think, even though it's not one of the highest priorities for the deck, it will be one of your best payoffs if you end up in a full-on aristocrat-style Rakdos deck. Next up is Scophos or Scophos War Leader. It's 4 in a red for a 4/5 common Minotaur warrior creature. 5 mana 4/5. I think that's decent. There's a lot of 3/4s in this set, and I don't think expensive creatures are going to be like the be-all end-all, because a lot of times games will play out where small creatures are being enchanted and just become big over time. So I'm not sure you want too many of these expensive kind of vanilla-ish creatures in your deck, but it does have some sacrifice synergy here. It says for red mana, you can sacrifice another creature or an enchantment, and it gets +1/+0 and gains menace until end of turn. Again, you can activate that multiple times. This isn't like the Blood Aspirant where you have to tap it, but it is 1 sacrifice per additional power, so you're not really going all in on this one the same way you could with like Slaughter Priest Amogus, right? That guy gets 2 power every time you sacrifice a permanent, period. Whereas this thing only gets +1. And yes, menace is decent on a 5/5 creature, but it's not like so huge that you're willing to sacrifice things that you otherwise wouldn't be willing to sacrifice. So this is just kind of a filler common that helps you enable the strategy while also getting a little bit of a payoff. This one does not trigger off sacrificing other permanents to other effects like the first 2 cards we've talked about. It has to actually activate its own ability and sacrifice something, so keep that in mind. Lampad of Death's Vigil is up next. This is 1 in a black for a 1/3 common enchantment creature. It's a nymph, and for 1 mana you can sacrifice a creature. Each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. This is a 2-headed giant all-star right here. This sort of effect doesn't come up too often where you can just dump creatures into draining your opponent out, but it is very relevant, right? Sometimes you're playing an aggressive red-black deck and you just so happen to get your opponent down to 4 or 5 life, and then they've stabilized and they're controlling the game. A single Lampad of Death's Vigil can end that game, right? Because you just amass a board. Maybe they can't attack anymore. Maybe you're not able to get through, but the Lampad can sack your board to finish the game off. This is not the type of effect that you want to be using willy-nilly. Again, you don't want to sacrifice real creatures to this effect just to get your pumps on other things. You want to sacrifice token fodders or things that want to die naturally. Or if you have a bunch of raise dead type effects or reanimation, then this sort of thing gets a little bit better too. But I'm trying to say at the same time to not underrate it, that you shouldn't overrate it either, right? You want at most 1 of this sort of card in your deck. And also note the black creatures. I might be wrong about this. Actually, we'll see another card here in a second. But at least in the case of Lampad of Death's Vigil, you can only sacrifice creatures. This one cannot sacrifice enchantments. So again, that's just something to keep in mind. Soul Reaper of Mogus is 2 in a black for a 2/3. It is a common enchantment Minotaur Shaman, and for 2 in a black you can sacrifice a creature to draw a card. So a couple things about this. Again, this is a little bit better than Lampad of Death's Vigil just on its face value. It's a better attacker and blocker. It can actually turn into card advantage, whereas Lampad of Death's Vigil is card disadvantage for the sake of draining your opponent out. And there can be actual game plans with Soul Reaper of Mogus, where this is kind of your strategy, right? Is to sacrifice small creatures that want to die for certain triggers and turn that into more cards, whereas Lampad of Death's Vigil just turns that into extra damage. And we saw this card, I believe, in War of the Spark. I think besides being an enchantment in different creature types, it's the same exact card. I want to say it was a Spark Reaver or something along those lines. And that was a pretty decent card. Granted, that format had a lot more sacrifice fodder because of amass as a mechanic. So I'm not saying, or what I'd warn against is trying to directly compare them. Just because that card was good in War of the Spark doesn't necessarily mean that Soul Reaper Mogus is going to be an all-star in this format. I do think it's going to be fine. And if you find out that you're getting a bunch of these red and black creatures that want to die, I would prioritize the Soul Reaper over something like this Lampad or the Skophos War Leader. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about our enablers, our synergy cards, kind of the bread and butter that makes this work. We've already seen all of the sacrifice outlets at common and uncommon. There's going to be a couple others here, but they're a little bit wonkier. These are the cards that I think you're looking to pick up after you know that you're in the strategy, rather than first picking them and trying to move into red-black. First one up is Careless Celebrant. This is 1 and a red for a 2/1. It's an uncommon. It's a Satyr Shaman. And when it dies, it deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. Keep in mind, this cannot actually hit your opponent, so don't try to make that mistake. Careless Celebrant's just a great card, right? You don't have to be in black-red for this card to be awesome, because it's often going to just trade up for an opponent's creature. It can trade on curve, right? This will trade for almost every 2-drop in the set. But in addition to that, if this blocks, say, a 4/4, you can just ping it for 2 more damage and trade off. So Careless Celebrant is very good in combat, and it's also one of those creatures that you actually don't mind sacrificing if you can turn its death trigger into an actual removal spell. If there's something worth shocking on board, then sacrificing this to something like your Soul Reaper to draw a card and also kill an opponent's creature seems quite good. So this is the type of card you'll pick up multiples of, and it should be pretty good. Whereas the next card, Discordant Piper, is a little bit worse than that. This one is also a 2-mana 2/1. It's 1 and a black. And the death trigger here is that it creates a 0/1 white goat creature token. I don't know why it does that. I guess something about being a piper, but whatever. 2 mana 2/1 that dies into a 0/1. That's pretty decent, right? It's not as good as dealing 2 damage to something, but getting to leave behind a body means that you have an extra creature to sacrifice to your effect. So if you're all in on sacrificing things and you're just looking for quantity over quality, then Discordant Piper is going to give you 2 sacrifice outlets, while also being a body that can trade for other things as well, right? Trading this off for an actual creature is kind of nice if you can then use the goat for something relevant. So again, I'm thinking Soul Reaper of Mogus being kind of our primary card there. Turning this into 2 additional cards doesn't seem that bad, or even 1 card off of just the goat if the Discordant Piper gets to trade for something itself. We have Satyr's Cunning, which we talked about in our red-white video. This is just a pretty poor card that gives you a way to create multiple bodies throughout the course of the game, and it has the cheapest escape cost at exiling just 2 other cards from your graveyard. The effect is for 1 mana you make a 1/1 Satyr that can't block, but the escape cost is 3 and exiling 2 cards. So for every 3 mana that you can spend on this card and every additional 2 cards that you don't care about in your graveyard, you can make an additional 1/1, which is more sack fodder, right? So again, Satyr's Cunning as a standalone card is pretty bad. I don't think it's going to be super swingy, but there are some strategies like red-white and in particular here, red-black, that will care about this card more than others. It is the type of card that people at the table when you're drafting should not be interested in, because it is such a poor quality card. So you should be able to wheel this card and prioritize other things over it. Grim Physician, in the same vein of creatures that want to die, it is a 1 black 1/1 zombie common. It's creature, and when it dies, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. So again, this is the kind of thing that it's not going to kill your opponent's bomb or anything, but it's a nice card to have just kind of floating around, and it can mess up combat, right? It essentially adds an additional point of damage to anything that rumbles in combat, as long as you have a way to sacrifice it. It's not the type of thing I want to recur over and over again. I'd rather be, making an extra creature with my Piper or dealing 2 damage with my Cruel Celebrant. But as far as kind of a nuts and bolts common goes for this archetype, I think Grim Physician could be worse. It could also be better. Don't take like 1,000 of these. Also worth noting that Grim Physician just in combat does trade up for 2/2, since it will deal a point of damage and then also shrink something else, and it is a pretty good token killer at the very least. Dream Shaper Shaman is 5 in a red for a 5/4 uncommon enchantment creature. It's a Minotaur Shaman. It's a little complicated. It says on your end step, at the beginning of your end step, you may pay 2 in a red and sacrifice a non-land permanent. That can be an artifact in addition to like a creature or enchantment. If you do, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land permanent. Put that card on the battlefield, and the rest go to the bottom randomly. So this lets you, on your end step, pay 3 mana to essentially polymorph a permanent into the next permanent that shows up on top of your library. And it skips over lands, right? You can't sacrifice lands, but you also can't hit lands, so you're not going to downgrade that much. I think stat-wise, 6 mana 5/4 is definitely below par in this set. There are quite a few 5 mana 4/4s and 5 mana 4/5s and 5/4s and things of that nature. So there's a lot of things that trade off for Dreamshaper Shaman for less mana than what you're going to cast. It's also an enchantment in a color pair that doesn't really care about enchantments very much, which I should have mentioned in other videos, but red and blue, well, blue cares. Red doesn't really particularly have a lot of enchantment synergy, so being an enchantment is actually usually a downside for those cards because it just makes them vulnerable to more removal, enchantment removal in addition to creature removal, whereas you're not actually getting the benefit of being an enchantment like some of the other colors. So that's one thing that's actually kind of going against Dreamshaper Shaman here. A couple other things to note is that this card asks a lot of you. It asks, A, that you have mana on your end step that you want to use, so the turn you cast this, you're probably not activating the ability unless you have 9 mana that turn. It asks that you have things that are worth sacrificing, which we've already seen a couple, but you're not always going to have something worth sacrificing. And it also kind of assumes that the card that you're going to flip into has to be better than the card that you're sacrificing, right? If I'm sacrificing a real permanent, I don't want to hit something like a Grim Physician off of that or something like that, or a Mana Rock, right? So Dreamshaper Shaman takes a lot of setup, and its random nature leads me to believe that it's just not really going to be worth it. There are going to be some cool times where you flip into something awesome and you sacrifice something dorky, but that doesn't even happen the turn it comes down. You got to wait a full turn cycle and still have 3 mana up, so you're probably not casting a lot of other stuff during that turn either. I'm not in love with this card, but I wanted to mention here because it is a way to turn, little sacrifice fodder cards into potentially better cards, but you can also just cycle them into other dorky cards. I did want to do my due diligence and mention all of the cards that can sacrifice permanents, though, so that is why we're talking about Dreamshaper Shaman, even though my initial kind of gut reaction is to stay away from this card. Final Flare is 2 and a red for a common instant. As an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice a creature or enchantment. The effect, deal 5 damage to target creature. So I believe this is the common or uncommon. I believe this is the red card that does the most damage in this set. There's a red common that deals 2 damage. There's an uncommon that deals 3 damage. There's a common that deals 4 damage. And I think if you want to take care of a 5 toughness creature without any additional work, you're going to have to do Final Flare to that creature. That being said, Final Flare will take out about 90% of the creatures in this set, barring combat tricks. There aren't a lot of creatures that are bigger than, say, a 5/5, and Final Flare will do a good job, but you also have to have something that's worth sacrificing. Now, I actually do like Final Flare for a couple reasons against a couple archetypes, and I probably should have mentioned this from the offset. An advantage that Black-Red has is a lot of the removal, as we've mentioned in other videos, is enchantment-based, right? There are a lot of pacifism effects. There's this blue enchantment that turns your creature into a frog or whatever. There's the blue enchantment that turns something into an enchantment, basically stops it from being a creature. And Final Flare is a good way to just kind of take advantage of that, right? If your opponent's going to lock down your creature and you don't have a good way to get rid of that enchantment that's on your creature, cards like Final Flare or any of these sacrifice outlets are a good way to just kind of turn those into advantage, right? Final Flare is a type of card that without a lot of synergy, you might run one of. It can't hit players, so you're not lava axing them out of the game. But as a one of in a deck that maybe is sparse on removal or is just covering its bases and making sure that it can take care of basically any threat, I think a single Final Flare will do a good job. Portent of Betrayal is reprinted from original Theros. If I recall correctly, that card was horrendously bad in original Theros. This sort of effect just usually costs 3 mana, and it's not particularly good at 3 mana, so making it 4 mana and adding a scry onto it is not great. If you don't know, Portent of Betrayal is 3 and a red for a sorcery. It's a common. You gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap it, gains haste, scry 1. So it's your standard threaten effect, but for 4 mana, you're paying an additional mana for a scry, which really just isn't worth it in the case of a card that sometimes just doesn't do anything. I'm not going to go into a tirade about why active aggression or rather active treason and these threaten effects just aren't really something you want to include in your deck, but it is worth mentioning here because when you're playing a red-black sacrifice deck in a limited format, usually what you're looking for is a way to take control of an opponent's creature and use their creature as your sacrifice fodder. As we mentioned, though, a lot of these other cards require mana costs. Think like the Dream Shaper Shaman costs 3 mana to activate. Final Flare costs 3 mana. A lot of these things cost mana in addition to the 4 mana that you have to pay for the Portent of Betrayal. So it's a lot less likely that you're going to be able to steal your opponent's best creature and sacrifice it to a bunch of these effects. Something like the Cavern of Lampad can set that up because it only costs 1 mana to activate that ability, but a lot of these abilities are expensive, so I don't think you're going to draft 3 or 4 Portent of Betrayals and just continuously take your opponent's creatures and sack them the same way you could with like an Act of Treason, just because that whole point of mana makes a huge difference. But it is a common way to steal an opponent's creature and hopefully use it as one of your sacrifice fodder. And that brings us to the rares. There's a bunch of decent rares for red-black, and I think it's worth going over most of them. Let's go ahead and talk about the big splashy mythic here. Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger, is black-red, 2 mana for a 6/6. Okay, it's a mythic rare legendary elder giant, and it kind of has this evoke clause. It says, if it enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escaped. And we'll go ahead and skip down there and let you know that the escape cost is black, red, exile 5 other cards from your graveyard. So you can bring this back from the graveyard and it will stick around, but you have to pay 4 mana and exile 5 cards from your graveyard. You might be wondering, well, why would I play it if it's just going to sacrifice itself? And that's because it has an enter the battlefield trigger. It says whenever Kroxa enters the battlefield or attacks, each opponent discards a card, then each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card this way loses 3 life. So if you just pay 2 mana, your opponent has to discard a card because this is going to enter the battlefield. Even though you sacrifice it right away, you still get that enter the battlefield trigger. So it's kind of like a 2 mana sorcery that sits in your graveyard and then you can escape it later on. When you do escape it, you get another card out of your opponent's hand, and then when this thing attacks, you get an additional card out of your hand. And every time it attacks from there, your opponent's just going to be completely empty-handed by that point. The way this works is your opponent chooses what they discard. This isn't random or anything like that. And basically, if they didn't discard a non-land card, they lose life, right? So this can get them very early on, right? The only way they can stop themselves from losing life is to discard lands, and they're going to run out of those. They're not going to want to discard their lands early on unless they're super flooded. And this can come back as early as turn 4. I don't think you should expect that very often. I think around turn 6-ish is when you'll have 5 other cards in your graveyard, unless you are actively trying to mill yourself. But red-black is not particularly good at that, and this card isn't very good at being splashed, being double red for the escape cost. So it's a little bit finicky. I do think it's a balanced card for how powerful it is, but if you can escape this bad boy and put it on the battlefield, you're going to win that game if your opponent doesn't deal with it. Same goes for the other Titan we'll talk about here in a little bit. The reason I really wanted to mention it is on top of just being a powerful card in general, is there's a couple tricks you can do with it. If you have a sacrifice outlet on board and the mana to activate it, you can play Kroxa, and when it enters the battlefield, the sacrifice trigger goes on the stack, and then you can actually sacrifice it to some other ability before it sacrifices itself. So you can get a little bit of extra value there while still getting the ETB effect off of Kroxa. The Akroan War is a red saga. It's a rare. Chapter 1, I should say the mana cost. It's 3 in a red. So 4 mana for a rare saga. Chapter 1 says gain control of target creature for as long as the Akroan War remains on the battlefield. So think about that for a second. It doesn't give that creature haste or anything. It doesn't untap it. You just kind of get to steal your opponent's best creature. The turn this comes into play, you're going to keep it the turn after when Chapter 2 goes off, and then you will lose it on the draw step, presumably when Chapter 3 goes off. So just keep that in mind. This isn't a permanent mind control. You get to keep the creature for basically an additional turn after you play this card. So Chapter 1, steal your opponent's best creature. Chapter 2 Until your next turn, creatures your opponents control attack each combat if able. So you kind of force your opponent to tap out. They can play around that a little bit by using activated abilities or just playing a couple blockers during post-combat main phase. So this isn't going to always leave them completely vulnerable, but they're going for flavor here, and it makes your opponent attack into you. Keep in mind, if you go chapter 1, steal their best creature, and that creature is tapped, and then it comes back around to your turn. If you really want to optimize using that creature to eat your opponent's creatures, you can't really attack with it. You have to leave it back on blocking duty, but that's fine. Hopefully, chapter 2, you get to eat some of your opponent's best creatures, especially since you probably control their actual best creature. And then chapter 3 comes around, and it says each tapped creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. So this shouldn't affect your creatures because you will have untapped before this ability goes on the stack, but you will also have made your opponent attack out at you with chapter 2, which means by the time it rolls around for chapter 3, your opponents or creatures are all just going to hit themselves basically, and that should kill a decent number of them. This is just a very swingy card. It's actually hard to talk about. It is worth noting that after chapter 3 happens, the Akroan War will go away, and if you still control their best creature, they're going to get that thing back. And it's hard to get that tapped so that it deals damage to itself because you'll have untapped it before chapter 3 goes off, like I already mentioned. But this is basically a way to make sure your opponent is losing creatures over the course of a couple of turns while also denying them access to their best creature. The real reason we wanted to mention it here, and we haven't mentioned it in any other video, is because you do want to sacrifice that creature before you get a chance to give it back to your opponent. Before chapter 3 goes off and before the Akroan War goes away, you want to sacrifice their best creature before they get it back and hopefully put in work with chapter 2 while owning their best creature. On top of that, sagas play especially well in this archetype. In any archetype that cares about sacrificing creatures and enchantments, there's a neat little trick you can do. Once chapter 3 goes on the stack, after it resolves, you end up sacking the saga. So if you put chapter 3 on the stack, the saga is still on board. You can sacrifice it to some other ability. Very similar to what we said with Kroxa. Before it goes away from its own trigger, you can use it to enable one of your sacrifice fodder cards, something like the Soul Reaper. Well, maybe not the Soul Reaper because that can't sacrifice enchantments, but you get the point. Anything that can sacrifice enchantments, you can use to sacrifice a saga before it goes away, as long as you let that last trigger go on the stack first. That moves us into Woe Strider. We mentioned this in the very first video for Blue-Black, but this is the real natural home for it. The reason we mention it in Blue-Black was because it is an efficient escape creature. The reason we're going to mention it here is because it is the best sacrifice outlet in the entire set. It is a free sacrifice outlet. You can just sacrifice another creature to scry 1, and on top of that, when it enters the battlefield, you make that 0/1 goat, so you get an extra little a little piece of sacrifice fodder attached to it. A 0/1 goat is not a full card. It's not really worth a card, but you're getting so much more. And yes, this still has all the escape stuff we talked about in the previous videos, but this is the card that you're looking to start off with and then move into red-black because it does just let you sacrifice whatever you need to for value. It is worth noting that we haven't mentioned yet in this archetype, escape is just naturally pretty good for this archetype, and even though you're not going to be able to escape the same creature over and over and over again, it does give you basically 2-for-1s, right? If you can escape a creature after that creature already traded in combat, that's a 2-for-1. And it does mean that you have additional access to creatures that you can sacrifice by escaping those creatures. So Woe Strider, altogether the kind of pinnacle of sacrifice payoff and sacrifice outlet all in one. And this is the rare that I would most likely start off with and then move into red-black. Treacherous Blessing is 2 and a black for a rare enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, draw 3 cards. So 3 mana, draw 3 on an enchantment is very powerful. It has some downside though. It says whenever you cast a spell, you lose a life. So assuming you can't get rid of this card, you are going to lose over the course of the game if you cast too many spells. So that's actually a pretty significant downside, but there's a way to get over it. It says whenever Treacherous Blessing becomes the target of a spell or ability, sacrifice it. So you presumably have to use something, use one of your cards to get rid of this Treacherous Blessing, and a lot of times that's going to involve casting a spell, which means you're going to lose a life. So that's a pretty high cost to pay. If you can't get rid of this, you're going to lose a lot of life just for casting spells, and sometimes that becomes the opponent's game plan, is just to put you in a spot where you can't actually cast too many more spells. Now, red-black has an extra advantage because some of these creatures can sacrifice enchantment. So what you do is you cast your Treacherous Blessing, you draw your 3 cards, and then you use one of your sacrifice outlets to just get rid of it for value even. And you just had a basically free 3 mana draw 3 with almost no downside if you didn't cast anything in between there. And in fact, you probably got upside because you got some sort of additional effect out of whatever you used to sacrifice this. So Treacherous Blessing will be a very interesting card for most black decks. You'll have to find a way to get rid of it or target it with a spell or ability, but for red-black, that's pretty easy. Nightmare Shepherd. This is a very powerful bomb. It's 2 black for a 4/4 flying enchantment creature. It's a demon. It's a rare, obviously. And it says whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may exile it. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a 1/1, and it's a nightmare in addition to its other types. So basically, whenever a non-token you control dies, you get to create a 1/1 version of that creature. And if it has any enter the battlefield triggers or anything along those lines, those things happen because that token will enter the battlefield. This is already just a standalone, very solid, powerful flyer, like 4 mana 4/4 flyer, very strong. Again, being an enchantment, a little bit of a downside since black isn't super big on actual enchantments as much as it is auras, but not complete downside. And this is just great in red-black where you're going to be losing creatures. It basically turns all of your non-token creatures into an additional copy of themselves, which means you just have twice as much sack fodder as normal. There are cards like the Cruel Celebrant, or not Cruel Celebrant, but the Celebrant we talked about, and the Piper, that when they die have additional effects, and then you get copies of those and you can sacrifice those with the Nightmare Shepherd on board and basically double up on all of your death triggers, all of your enter the battlefield triggers, and just get additional attackers and blockers. Really sweet card, generically powerful enough that you can play it in basically any black deck and it's going to do work, and your opponent has to kill it or they will lose, but red-black seems like a very fit-in home for it. Erebos Bleak-Hearted is your mono-black god. She is rather, I think Erebos is a guy. He is 3 and a black for a 5/6 legendary enchantment god, mythic rare, indestructible. It does have the devotion clause, which means that your devotion black has to be 5 or greater, otherwise Erebos is not a creature. But we don't really care too much about that for the sake of this archetype. What I do care about is the fact that whenever another creature you control dies, you may pay 2 life to draw a card. And red-black is going to be the archetype where creatures are dying the most because you're actively going out of your way to kill your own creatures. So being able to turn that into extra card draw, we've already mentioned, is very powerful. Erebos lets you do that with life investment instead of mana investment, so you can't go hog wild on it and just draw tons of cards, but this should be able to give you a bunch of extra cards throughout the course of a game if you start a draft off with Erebos. In addition to that, you can pay 1 in a black, sacrifice another creature, and target creature gets -2/-1 until end of turn. -2/-1 is a little bit weird. It's usually not enough to kill a creature, but it's enough to threaten activation during combat to the point where your opponent can't actually really attack or block with certain creatures anymore. You do have to sacrifice creatures for that effect. You do have to pay mana, but we're talking about an archetype that cares about sacrifice and things. So everything I've said up to this point is true for Erebos as well. You have to have creatures that you want to be sacrificing, but Erebos pays you off for doing so in a very big way. Alright, so we talked about red-black forever. Blue-green is going to go a lot quicker because there's not quite as much to talk about. If you flash back to my previous video where I talked about blue-white and how it's just kind of a loose, non-linear enchantment-based strategy where you kind of just draft blue cards and white cards and you put them together, blue-green is essentially the same thing. It's got a little bit of a different edge to it because it has different cards in green that you don't get in white, whereas blue-white has removal spells along the lines of Banish and Light and the Dreadful Apathy. You know, this enchantment-based removal. Green has more like fight spells and things along those lines and just big creatures. So this is a more aggressive color pair that has blue for constellation triggers, whereas blue-white is a more controlling color pair, if that makes sense. But even so, when we look at the uncommon and the rare, it's not very clear that you're supposed to be doing one thing or another. Again, just a very non-linear archetype. And again, I want to reiterate that that doesn't mean blue-green is going to be bad. It just means that it's not as focused. You've got a little bit more direction as far as what you can do when you're drafting this color. So with that being said, let's go ahead and look at our payoff cards, starting with the gold uncommon, Eutropia. The twice favored is 1 green blue for a 2/2 uncommon legendary human wizard, and it's pretty simple. Constellation says whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. That creature gains flying until end of turn. So this is very clearly a powerful payoff for playing enchantments, right? Being able to jump a creature, put a counter on it, and just make it bigger over the course of a game is very nice. And it doesn't really ask that you do anything other than draft and play enchantments. It is not itself an enchantment, but that's fine, right? And as we saw in a lot of the other green videos and blue videos, it's not really hard to pick up an enchantment in this set. If you want enchantments, you're going to get them, and you're just going to incidentally have a bunch of enchantments just because a lot of the creatures are enchantment creatures in this set. So Eutropia, again, isn't really a direction for the deck. It's just a payoff for being in the deck because it is such a powerful card. Worth noting that Eutropia is powerful enough that it is splash worthy, and I can see Bant decks coming together where they're blue, green, and white kind of all combined together using the best of all the constellation triggers and the best of the payoffs. So Eutropia is not necessarily one of those cards that is going to get passed to you if you're the only blue-green drafter at the table, because other people might be interested in splashing her. Brine Giant we mentioned in the blue-white video, but hey, it's worth mentioning again here just because it is kind of like a de facto common payoff for having a bunch of enchantments on board. Again, this is the 7 mana 5/6 in blue that costs 1 less to cast for each enchantment you control. You're just going to have enchantments on board. You should be able to reliably cast this thing for about 5 mana, and a 5 mana 5/6 is on par with some of the better commons and uncommons in this set. It just has no abilities, right? It's kind of a big dorky creature, but there are times later in the game where sometimes you cast this for 3 mana and you get to double spell, and that's because you are in an archetype that just happens to care about having enchantments on board. Again, Brine Giant, not like the big payoff that you're actively looking for, but a card that I think is going to be a little bit better than it seems, and it doesn't seem particularly good, but you will see Brine Giants in play. This card will get played a lot. Destiny Spinner we mentioned as well in I believe the green-white video. Green-white, again, cared a lot about having creatures that were enchanted or were enchantments themselves. Blue-green cares less about that and just cares about the word enchantment being somewhere on a creature. Destiny Spinner was the 2 mana 2/3 that stops your enchantments and creatures from being countered, which is mostly trinket text, but kind of matters and will be something that people forget about and run into from time to time. And then for 4 mana, you can turn one of your lands into an XX, where X is the number of enchantments you control until end of turn, which is just a decent mana sink. And I don't see a lot of mana sinks in this format, so having that sort of ability is pretty nice. If you want my full kind of opinion on these cards, you can check out some of the previous videos because I've already mentioned Brine Giant, I've already mentioned Destiny Spinner, and I don't know that blue-green is the natural home for either of these cards, but they will be playable within this archetype if you end up in this color pair. Neshin Wanderer is a card we haven't talked about yet. It is 1 and a green for a 1/3 uncommon Satyr Scout, and it has Constellation. When an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a land from among them, put it in your hand, put the rest on the bottom randomly. So Neshin Wanderer is a way to just make sure that you're constantly hitting land drops and make sure that you're getting advantage out of your Constellation triggers. As we mentioned in a previous video, none of the Constellation cards in this set are actually enchantments themselves, so there's kind of this little bit of a tension between how many Constellation cards you want and how many enchantments you actually end up drafting in order to make those Constellation cards work. I think if you really put in the work, you can have a Constellation deck and it will come together more often than it won't. Neshin Wanderer seems like a pretty good card to curve into. Just turning all your enchantments into a potential extra land is very nice. It does put the land in your hand, so it's not ramp, but it is card advantage, and it only really takes 1 enchantment and 1 land hit off of Neshin Wanderer for this card to justify its spot. 2 mana 1/3, also perfectly respectable for an effect like this. It's not meant to be attacking, it's meant to just get you incremental advantage over the course of the game, and I think it does a pretty good job of that. Moving into our enablers, there's not a lot to talk about here. We're going to rehash a little bit, but blue-green doesn't have a lot of identity. It doesn't really scream do this or do that. So, it seems like a little bit of a cop-out to talk about a Theros archetype and just say, hey, draft enchantments, but that's what blue-green is basically asking you to do. And I would be remiss to not mention Shimmerwing Chimera again. This is the 4-mana 3/2 enchantment creature with fly-in that lets you bounce one of your enchantments back to your hand at the beginning of the turn. Look, if you're looking for constant constellation triggers, I think this is probably the best in the business. Shimmerwing Chimera lets you reuse some of the omens or any enchantment that has an enter the battlefield trigger, which is also going to let you constellation over and over again. I think this card is absolutely nuts for this format and is going to put in a lot of good work. Very first pickable, and as you see, it bridges the gap between some of these Bant archetypes like blue-white and blue-green. It's a pretty safe pick early on. It pays you off for being in an enchantment-heavy deck, and it is itself an enchantment if that matters for your deck, which hopefully it does. And we want to mention Calliphy again, Beloved of the Sea. We mentioned this in the previous video as well. This is the blue demigod, the 3-mana X3 with power equal to your devotion to blue. So base level, 3-mana 2/3. And the reason we're mentioning it here is because it does give you that extra layer of protection for your enchantments. It says creatures and enchantments you control have spells your opponents cast that target this permanent cost 1 more to cast. So your opponent has to overpay for any removal spells that they're going to use to target your creatures, and on top of that, target your enchantment. So everything I said about these creatures in blue-white is still true here for blue-green. I don't know that they're better in one archetype than the other. Keep in mind, again, blue-green seems to care more about attacking, whereas blue-white seems more about shutting your opponent's cards down. So take what you will of that. That means cards like Calliphy, you want to go more into the blue devotion so that you have a better attacker, but these are going to be good in either archetype regardless. And that brings us to the rares, starting with the blue-green Titan, Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. So everything we said about the red-black Titan is true here as well. It has an escape cost of green, green, blue, blue. You exile 5 other cards from your graveyard, so that's essentially the same with different color requirements. When it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it unless it escaped. So you get the one-time enter the battlefield trigger, and then when you escape it, you get the enter the battlefield trigger again, but the creature actually sticks around on board. This one happens to be 3 mana, so it's 1 green blue, and it's still a 6/6, just like Troxa. And the effect here on enter the battlefield or attack is that you gain 3 life, and then you draw a card, and then you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. Like, I'm so sick of green cards doing everything under the sun. Like, look at the Grey Henge. We're not going to get into that right now, but this card didn't need to be as powerful as it is. It is just insanely powerful for what it's worth. Even 3 mana to gain 3 life, draw a card, and ramp ahead seems very powerful to me. If you never escape this card, like, that's a fine card. Maybe not mythic worthy, not a game-winning card. But if you ever stick this card with escape and your opponent doesn't deal with it, the game is just over. And this is the type of card where, blue-green doesn't care too much about escape in its cards. In fact, green doesn't have a lot of escape overall. That's mostly in black. But blue-green, you can basically build an entire deck around just escaping this card a couple times and using this as your win con. It doesn't have evasion, despite being this enormous Titan or anything. There's no trample, there's no flying or anything like that, but the attack trigger just gains you life, draws you cards, and ramps you all in one, and you get to do that on ETB as well. Plus, as just a 3 mana play, you get to basically use this as a sorcery that gives you all of those things all in one time. So this gives you everything you want on a card. Life gain, card draw, ramp, on top of a giant body that's going to win the game if it's unanswered. And that's not asking too much here. Like, nothing about this card is asking you to do very much. Basically, you have to just make sure you're playing Simic and make sure you can get 5 other cards in your graveyard. But again, there is a lot of graveyard removal in this set, so it's not completely safe. You want to get it out as soon as possible. Basically a busted card. If you open it, you should be playing it. I don't know that you should 100% splash this in another deck unless your mana fixing is insane, because green, green, blue, blue is hard to pull off outside of straight up Simic, but I don't know, the power level is there. I would maybe try it out if I opened one. Next up is a second Simic rare. It's Enigmatic Incarnation. That's fun to say. 2 green, blue, 4 mana for just an enchantment. This one is not a creature. So 4 mana enchantment that says, at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice another enchantment. If you do, search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the sacrificed enchantment's converted mana cost. Put that card onto the battlefield, shuffle your library. So kind of a Neoform, Prime Speaker Vannifar, Birth and Pod type effect that turns enchantments into creatures. This is very weird, and it can't sacrifice itself, which I find strange. And on top of that, the converted mana cost of the creature you search up has to be exactly 1 plus whatever you're sacrificing. So the way this works is it comes to your end step, which is significant. That means you can get value out of this the turn you play it. You don't have to wait all the way until your next upkeep. But you sacrifice, let's say, a 3-drop enchantment, and then you get to go search your library for a 4-drop creature and put it on the battlefield. And then the following turn, maybe you sacrifice that 4-drop creature, you get to go search for a 5-drop, so on and so forth. I'm not sure that this card is really good or not. This is the type of card I would have to see in action, and it does require you to kind of build your deck around it. You need to make sure you have multiples of 2-drops, 3-drops, 4-drops, 5-drops, and on top of that, you need to make sure enough of them are enchantments that you can actually trigger this ability. Again, this is not a super powerful rare, I don't believe. Turning a 4-drop into a 5-drop isn't exactly game busting unless you're getting a very powerful enter the battlefield trigger. One thing I want to note about effects like this, and I noted this with Prime Speaker Vannifar, is if you are playing this card in your deck, I think it's very relevant in paper to just make a quick list on a piece of paper of all of the creatures you can get at each converted mana cost. That way you don't have to sit there and think about, oh, what can I get? You just have a short list. So cards like this that search for these kind of specific creatures in your deck, it's worth having a little list on the side to keep track of what you can get. Protean Thaumaturge, we talked about this in Blue Light. We'll talk about it again real quick. This is just 2 mana 1/1 with Constellation that turns it into a copy of a creature, and then it regains that ability. So you can, as long as you're playing enchantments, you can always turn this into the best creature on board. Seems kind of insane to turn this into a Titan, right? Because it doesn't have to sacrifice itself, but that's best case scenario. Sometimes this is just going to be a dorky creature, but most of the times it should be at least on par with whatever the best creature on board is. And as I mentioned in Blue White, this is just the type of card that can provide a win con for a deck that's really kind of searching for a win con. You're not always going to have Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, right? So sometimes you need to make it work with your Protean Thaumaturge and just turn that into some sort of evasive threat and get in there. Maybe turn it into a big beater if your opponent plays something better than yours. And let's talk about Setessan Champion again. This is the 3 mana 1/3 Constellation creature that gives a 1/1 counter and draws a card whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield. Just, again, a very powerful Constellation card that you can pick up early and try to draft as many enchantments as possible. This is even, despite being a 3 mana 1/3, not a terrible draw in the late game because it turns any additional enchantments you draw after that point into card draw and becomes bigger for your work, while also just being an insano 3-drop that turns all your enchantments into card advantage. So powerful Constellation creatures are what you're looking for here in blue-green if you don't happen to open some sort of bomb mythic rare. And that's going to go ahead and do it for all of the color pairs. That leaves us with one video left where we will talk about devotion decks. I'm still not convinced that devotion decks are going to exist. We'll actually see when we get to the next video. There's not as much devotion as you would assume there would be in a Return to Theros, but there are devotion cards floating around, and that does mean that there is the potential for some mono card shenanigans. But we'll save that conversation for the next video and go ahead and wrap it up here. Again, if this has been useful in any way, shape, or form, or if me rambling for 40 minutes has taught you something or been beneficial to you, feel free to drop a like on the video or subscribe below to the channel. It means a lot. And I'd love to hear from you guys if I missed something, or if you think there was a card worthy of mention here, or if you know what the heck blue-green is supposed to be doing and I just completely missed what the archetype was supposed to be doing in this format. Please let me know in the comments below, or find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. That's going to go ahead and wrap us up for this video. Thanks for watching. My name's Timothy here with ManaRocks, and I will see you all in the last video.